Brothers and sisters, let's see. First of all, in the corner, can you hear me clearly? Can you hear me if I'm away from the microphone as well? It's really an honor for me and my wife Dorothy to be here with all of you on this occasion. I don't think anyone loves the Book of Mormon any more than I do, but I'm sure you feel the same way, that you love it more than anybody else. There are lots of things that sustain the book. Of course, the Spirit is critical and the most important aspect of knowing and loving and knowing it is true. I would like to speak, as indicated there, on the Catholic chroniclers, or the writers, historians of the 16th century in Latin America. The majority were Catholic friars. They were experienced men, very educated men, and very able in their historical historical writings. Brother John Tavetinus and two other writers. I didn't bring the book with me, but last year a book came out regarding the echoes and evidences of the Book of Mormon. It's a very erudite book. It has things in there that most people wouldn't be aware of. And Brother Tavetinus is one of the three men who wrote in the book. There were many writers, but these three edited the book. And in the book, it's interesting, he wrote something that, and I'd like to use his words if I may, because even though my content would differ from his, the title suits both. The title was Ancient Texts in Support of the Book of Mormon. And he goes on to say, in recent years, it has become more and more clear that elements of the Book of Mormon account have ancient precedents. Some of these elements are attested in the ancient texts that were unknown in Joseph Smith's day and could therefore not have been known to him. These ancient texts can help us appreciate the antiquity and historicity of the Book of Mormon account. End quote. If we, as members of the church, wish to draw more attention to the Book of Mormon, we should study it as a sacred text in the context of ancient texts. May I repeat that? Study it as a sacred text in the context of ancient texts. Now, some look for the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica, and that's fine. I hope they keep searching more and more in that regard. They're looking for the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica. I tend to look for Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon. I won't elaborate on that, but it's sometimes worthy of just a little bit of thought, because it gives us a little more, a broader understanding. Last year, another text came out written by Terrell L. Givens. It was printed in the eastern states. It's called By the Hand of Mormon. Some of you may know of Harold Bloom. He's the famous Jew, professor in 2 universities in the East, and one of the most prolific writers that has in this generation. Harold Bloom read Terrell Givens' book called By the Hand of Mormon, and he said the following: Terrell L. Givens' study of the Book of Mormon is vastly informative, particularly to the general reader who seeks for insight into this extraordinary work. There are enigmatic splendors in the Book of Mormon. Whether it was revealed to Joseph Smith or whether it emerged from his indubitable religious genius. This man knows a lot about the church. He even believed Joseph Smith to be a prophet. He's still a staunch Jew, of course. The reason I draw our attention to this book of Terrell Givens is going to be obvious in just a moment. Insights from Farms said this about his book. In this latest book, Givens examines the roles of the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon has played for both believers and detractors. He discusses its coming forth, its contents, and the debate over its historical authenticity. Given shows exactly why it has been impossible to understand Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon by finding some new middle ground between or beyond the polarities of authentic ancient history or fraudulent composition. That is no small thing to us. In his book he states, when Elder Talmadge of the Quorum of the Twelve removed archaeological footnotes from the Pratt edition of the Book of Mormon in the year 1920, and when Elder B.H. Roberts of the 70 informed church headquarters the next year, or in 1921, that objections to Book of Mormon historicity required further study, the church assumed a position of studied caution in regard to the Book of Mormon scholarship. However, not too many years later, in 1984, the pressure again was building to establish a more vigorous Book of Mormon apologetics, or defenders of the book. In that fall of that year, the church responded with 2 articles in the Ensign with some limited geography. The professionalism and focus brought to bear in the Book of Mormon scholarship by many scholars of farms contributed to a further dramatic shift in the year 1997. You remember that was the year when the Brigham Young University absorbed farms into its system. And in doing so, becoming part of the university, President Hinckley in giving the announcement his blessing, specifically noted the group's professionalism and credibility. With this gesture, the LDS Church indirectly, albeit officially, gave its stamp of approval to rationalistic, scientific endeavors to strengthen the faith in the Book of Mormon through what? Through scholarship. That's partly of what we're doing today. The scholarship that can absorb and intrigue the world as well as help us understand the book more. Over the many years, over a period of exactly 17 years, I've had a great desire to collect certain ancient books. I had found prior to that many years earlier some 2 or 3 old books, but then I knew there were about 20. And they were all mostly written in the 16th century, that is to say the mid-1500s. They were written in the main by Catholic friars, and the majority wanted to record the history prior to the conquest. And so they learned the language, determined to live there all of their life, and learned the history prior to the conquest. And this is what they recorded. There were probably 2 who had less desires to do that than promulgate Catholicism, like Diego de Landa, mentioned by Joseph earlier yesterday. Although he makes some startling comments in support of the Book of Mormon, not knowing what he was doing. But most of them were there as historians. So in collecting these books, most of them came from the Porrua bookstore in Mexico City. They were reprints of the books from the 1500s. Most of them are again out of print. And some of them are a little known to some people. Some people in the field know about Sahagún, de las Casas, Torquemada, and a few others. I'll quote a little bit from those authors of the 1500s, but most of my quotes will be from the text lesser known but equally respected. My focus could be on about 10 themes showing parallels between these old texts, 1500s, and the Book of Mormon. But I'll only touch one of those themes today, comparing the sacred text, the Book of Mormon, 3rd Nephi, and the coming of the Lord to this continent with what the historians of the 1500s recorded from the indigenous people. I don't mind if you interrupt by raising your hand if I'm saying something that should be repeated or if you have a question of what I'm talking about. This history prior to 1500 was kept by the ancients, by memory, by hieroglyphics, by manuscripts, writing on leather. In many different ways they preserved it other than just their memories. One of the texts that I'll mention is not one, well, there were 3 texts written by indigenous people of the 20 or 25 texts. The 3 written by indigenous people and the others written by Catholic historians in the main. And the ones written by the indigenous people, one is the Popol Vuh, and one is the Annals of the Kakshikels, and the other is the title of the Lords of Totonicapán. They were all written between 1550, 1554, and 1560. In the one book of Totonicapán, not within the text itself, but in the preface to the text, there's a paragraph written. It's a condensed version of 8 pages. Now, this has been written about in at least 3 books that I have found out. This is what it says. Written in the Totonicapán text was written in the Quiché language by those who signed it in the year 1554 in accordance with the tradition held by their ancestors. So about 15 Indian chiefs or heads of the nations wrote the book in that year 1554. And by way of interest, when I was residing in Guatemala in 1990, I think it was in 1991, I wrote to the church and asked for permission to do the temple work for these leaders of this nation, of the Quiché Maya. And they did authorize us to do it, so we did the work for these men. But in the front of that book, again, it's in the preface, it's not in the text itself, we read the following. This said manuscript consists of X number of pages, 31, but the translation of these first pages was omitted because they are of the creation of the world, Adam and the earthly paradise, in which Eve was deceived not by a serpent but by Lucifer himself as an angel of light. It deals with the posterity of Adam following in every respect the same order as Genesis and the sacred books as far as into the captivity of Babylonia. The manuscript assumes that these 3 great Quiché nations with which it particularly deals are descendants of the 10 tribes of the kingdom of Israel, whom Shalmaneser reduced to perpetual captivity and who, finding themselves on the border of Assyria, decided to emigrate. Now that was written again in the front of the book, and in the 3 books I've been able to find out since, and I'll read the context of one, they indicate that this wasn't Indian. This was a Catholic priest that wrote that, and they copied it. Let me read what one text says. The first 16 pages is a historical summary of events of people found in the Old Testament. The borrowing from Christian history and tradition, a common element in many Indian accounts written during this period, was an attempt to link Christian tradition to the Indians in order to increase, in part, the legitimacy of their land claims. So a Mexican scholar, Rene Acuña, has determined that this part that I just read you, and there's 16 pages in all, appears to have been copied almost word for word from another document written in 1553, now that's 1 year before this book came out, by a Dominican priest, Domingo de Vico. And now the inference is this, that the stated origins were not from the Indians, but from a Catholic father. So what they're saying is, this is not what the Indians believe, it's what the Catholic father believed. In other words, believed that they were from the 10 tribes of Israel, and they were from Babylonia. But then investigating a little bit further, I found the following. I ask you this question now. What reason would Father Domingo de Vico have to write this connection of the indigenous people with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and being Israelites, if there was not some truth to it? What was the source of his information? Surely indigenous history had something to do with it. Why did de Vico in 1553 write it if it were not important in the preservation of the Indian pre-conquest history? Interestingly enough, Farms did just a little bit of writing on this. They did this 8 years ago in April 1995. I'll just read a little bit. Interpreters of this document have commonly supposed that the Indians had inserted a Bible tradition about Israel that they simply picked up from the Spaniards. Why anyone would put the notion into a legally important native document is never clear in the speculation. It is clearly certain that Indian groups came to the conclusion that their ancestors were connected to the biblical history, that they simply concocted the notion of transoceanic connection is hard to believe. I wasn't satisfied even at that point in time, so I went a little further into the Land Titles Office in Guatemala. I'll read you in part first of all the preface to this and then the content. As a reward for valor in the conquest of Mexico, a man by the name of Pedro de Alvarado, one of Hernan Cortes's captains, was given the right to claim lands in Central America. He entered what is now known in Guatemala. He entered what is now known as Guatemala in the year, now keep the date in mind, in 1524, and appropriated much of the most valuable accessible land. I'll go back to that date in 24 later. In a later date, in 1546, the governing Catholic Church body declared that the Indian chiefs were the legal owners of the lands and not those captains. Well, a man came along later in 1659, and he wanted to prove he owned some land in Guatemala. And so he brought with him at that time, in 1659, he presented himself before the Spanish government's colonial office in Santiago, Guatemala. He brought with him a 15-page deed consisting of 3 half pages and 12 quarter sheets. And this document was the original title inscription obtained by the conquistadores from an Indian chief in the year 1524, written in Quiche. So what I'm going to read to you now was written, what would that be, 29 years before Father De Vico wrote that comment we read to you. The record of 1524, which has now been microfilmed in barely legible Old Spanish script, states, "We, these principals, declared that we claim title to this land because our parents and grandparents came here, and that we were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are of Israel. That we likewise were in Babylon, where all the Indians with great effort made a large edifice which remained unfinished, and the work did not progress. That all of us then spoke one language, but the building remained in that half-finished state because they had changed too many languages." Again, this is written in 1524, predating by 29 years the comments of this father, indicating the Indians had the belief, not necessarily this father. And this version is indisputably and undeniably recorded in the public records of the Republic of Guatemala in the year mentioned. So in summary, in 1524, the indigenous people stated they were from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Israel. Now, what does the book say itself? I'll read to you, just to refresh your memory as to what the Book of Mormon states, as to where this information, this belief came from. I'm reading from 1 Nephi chapter 5. "And after they had given thanks unto the God of Israel, my father Lehi took the records which were engraven upon the plates of brass, and he did search them from the beginning. And he beheld that they did contain the 5 books of Moses, which gave an account of the creation of the world, and also of Adam and Eve, who were our first parents, and also record of the Jews from the beginning even down to the commencement of the reign of Zedekiah the king of Judah. A genealogy of his fathers, wherefore he knew that he was a descendant of Joseph, even that Joseph who was a son of Jacob, who was sold into Egypt." So we know they brought with them the records which told them they were of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were from Israel. In checking the computer, I found that the number of times appearing in the Book of Mormon, the word Abraham appears 27 times. Abraham and Isaac appears 13 times. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the three together, appears another 13 times. The word Israel appears 188 times. And these are comments found in many of the ancient texts. Now, I won't read you the 13 times Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob appeared, but I will read you 3 to show you the dates. 600 BC, the Book of Mormon states in 1 Nephi, "For the fullness of mine intent is that I may persuade men to come unto the God of Abraham and to the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob and be saved." So nearly 400 years later, they still have maintained and retained the belief. Helaman 3. "And land their souls, yea, their immortal souls, at the right hand of God in the kingdom of heaven, and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and with all our holy fathers, to go no more out." Then 400 years later, or 400 AD, "But behold, I will show unto you a God of miracles, even the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." The belief, of course, retained all through the 1,000 years of the Book of Mormon. Now, I won't read you the 188 scriptures talking about Israel, but I would like to read one. In 1 Nephi 15. "Behold, I say unto you that the house of Israel was compared unto an olive tree by the Spirit of the Lord, which was in our father. And behold, are we not broken off from the house of Israel? Are we not a branch of the house of Israel? And at that day shall the remnant of our seed know that they are of the house of Israel." So with all those thoughts in mind, I will start to read from some of these old books to show how they sustain 1 Nephi. I could pick a lot of different themes, but as I mentioned before, I picked the one showing the relationship, the parallel, rather, between the 3rd Nephi and the coming of the Lord here with what the historians said in the 16th century. And as I read these people, their quotes, I will give their birth date. And you will notice that they will go from a birth date of 1459 to 1557. In other words, 98 years apart. Most did not know each other. And they lived in different areas of the Yucatan, southern Mexico, or Guatemala. Now, from the text, the Lords of Totonicapán, written 1554 by the indigenous people, page 12. "Our people came from the other side of the ocean where the sun rises, a place called Patulan Pasivan." And page 14. "These then were the 3 nations of Quiches, and they came from where the sun rises, descendants of Israel, of the same language and the same customs. Our ancestors were the sons of Abraham and Jacob." Page 64. "Now on the 28th of September, 1554, we sign this attestation in which we have written that by tradition our ancestors told us, who came from the other side of the sea, from Sivan Tulan, bordering on Babylonia." We found a lot of statements made in a lot of texts regarding the white bearded God. And I'll read you a lot of those now from these old texts. First of all, the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. No figure looms larger in Middle American history than Quetzalcoatl, whose name means feathered serpent in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. Central Americans honored him as the hero god who not only created mankind with his own blood, but granted man the gift of corn and thus civilization. That's from the Aztecs. Now from the Mayas. At this time, the Maya chronicles note the arrival in Yucatan of Kulkulkan, which means feathered serpent. A blend of man and God. Quetzalcoatl appears with various names and his different guises in the pre-conquest sculpture in the hieroglyphic books. In the year 1985, we were supervising the work in Central America from Mexico City. In the year 1990, then the first presidency divided the area into Mexico as one and Central America as another, and they asked us to go down and set up the offices in Guatemala City. We had been in and out of Guatemala for years. And on one occasion in 1885, I noticed from some good friends, all are purebloods, in the northwestern mountains of Guatemala, They said there was a man named Adrian Inés Chavez, who was a pureblood, who was the principal lecturer of the Mayan civilizations all over the world. And so one of my good friends who was then the stake president, became a mission president later, who was also a pureblood Mayan, he said, this Inés is a good man, and I know him well, and he would do anything for me, and I would do anything for him, but he has some very, very old books in his home, and he won't even let me see them. I've offered him money, and he told me how much, and I couldn't believe it. And he said, for no reason, he will let me see those books. I said, I have this old book of Totonicapán, which he'll be familiar with, but he won't have it. If you gave him a certified copy of this text of 1554, maybe he would let us go in and microfilm these old books. Again, we didn't know what the books were. We just knew they were old. And so he said, it's worth a try. He may well say yes after all this. And so he did give him the book, and he said, I must have that book. Come in today, microfilm these old books. I have to have that book. So we microfilmed them in 1985. Then 10 years later, 1995, Elder Scott of the 12 said, Ted, did you ever read those microfilms that you took? And I said, no, I've been in Guatemala in different areas. And he said, would you read them? And so I started to read them, and we found the handwritten text in Quiche Maya of the Popol Vuh, and we found an old text of 3 volumes of 500 pages each, from which I'll make one quote a little bit later on. We found also the handwritten context of another text. The Annals of the Kaqchikel is one of the 3 ancient texts written by the indigenous people. It was written in about 1560 by 2 men. That book is, or has been, available in English and in Spanish. What we managed to find out in those microfilms was the original handwritten text in Kaqchikel. And so I called down to my friends in Quetzaltenango in Guatemala, and I said, go to your Kaqchikel friends. There's 300,000 or 400,000 Kaqchikel Indians there in the country. Ask them if it would be valuable to them to have their original text in the original tongue. And they were very excited, and they said, yes, I should say. And so I sent them a page or 2 down, and then I took off the 97 pages, cleaned them up, amplified them, put them in, bound them in book form, and sent copies down. And they were delivered to the heads of the nations, to the mayors of the cities, and to the governor of the province in the National Theater, along with the Book of Mormon in Kaqchikel. They insisted, give us your book, because we'd already showed them the connection. Well, they were glad to get their book, and that Kaqchikel text, of course, was important because it shows the origin of their people. When they read the book, they said, you know, we're deeply grateful to you and the church for having done this, because it has preserved our history, which we had partly forgotten. It has preserved our own dialect, which we have mutilated. The next text I'd like to quote from is from Ixtlilxochitl. He was an Aztec prince, and he was born in 1568. Again, this is all related to the white-bearded god as related to 3rd Nephi. He said, I affirm that Quetzalcoatl, Huimac, was the chief of the Toltecs. He was a just and holy man. Quetzalcoatl was none other than Thomas the Apostle. He was identified with supreme deity and was the creator of the world. He was white, bearded. Now, those people don't have beards. He was white, bearded with abundant hair. His hair and beard nearly red with the characteristics of the gods of the morning and the rays of light that came forth from his body. The Toltecas have good knowledge of the creation of the world before the arrival of the Spaniards. They had knowledge of the great flood. They had knowledge that the flood destroyed the world. They knew God had created the plants, the animals, the birds. They said the world was created in the year del Tecpotl, and from that time until the great flood, they called it, I won't go into all of these words, but they claimed that this white-bearded God was the creator. They said, we knew this Isli Chotil, this prince, had access, he was a prince, so had access to the royal archives and the history that was recorded. So great credence is given to this man. He had learned Spanish perfectly, as well as his own dialect of Quiche Maya. He said, there were calamities and movements in the heavens long before the Spaniards arrived. The sun and moon were eclipsed at one time. Signs occurred that was in the year Sekali, and when adjusted to our time is the same time when Christ our Lord suffered. These or all things were known by the Toltecas from the creation of the world to nearly our day. A high tower was built. They knew all about it. My people knew all about the high tower. Languages were changed. No one understood the other, and they dispersed to many parts of the world. Quetzalcoatl was first. He was the universal God of all things, the creator of all, the Lord God of heaven, the creator of things visible and invisible. Then on volume 2, page 8, it says, there arrived to this land a man called Quetzalcoatl. Because of his great virtues, he was just, holy, and good. He taught them by works and words, the road of virtue also to avoid vices and sins, giving laws and good doctrine, and to refrain from wrongs and dishonesty. He disappeared along the coast of Coatzacoalco, and upon bidding them farewell, he said to his people he would return. According to our history, the above happened just about the same time that Christ was born. I won't read you the scriptures in the Book of Mormon. You're all aware of them regarding his birth. From 3 Nephi 11, there are several verses that talk in detail about it. Then a female archaeologist named Constance Irwin, who is highly regarded, started to quote Isli Xochitl, this prince. And in quoting him, she said, after he had investigated all available pre-conquest records and legends, aided by his ability to understand the native tongue and decipher the hieroglyphics, he wrote about his history. He talked about the fabulous person named Quetzalcoatl who appeared bringing civilization. Some of the legends hold when Quetzalcoatl reached the east coast, he sent back the following prophecy, and in time to come, surely his brethren, bearded and white like himself, would come to these shores. Quetzalcoatl, in all of America's past, no figure is more exciting, more tantalizing, or more frustrating than that of the fair god Quetzalcoatl. Inasmuch as it's a major theme in the Book of Mormon, it's logical that such a belief would be retained by the people as the centuries went on, and that's why it's the dominant theme in all these old texts that I have. In all of America's past, I read again, no figure is more exciting, more tantalizing, or more frustrating than the fair god Quetzalcoatl. The Indians believed Cortez was Quetzalcoatl because he was fair and he was bearded and he promised to return. He's the conqueror that came in about 1519. These Indian cultures, the author suggests, do not spring up independently, but as a result of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact between the old world and new. You'd think they came right out of the Book of Mormon. The legend of Quetzalcoatl was cherished by the Aztec, Mayas, and Incas, and behind these three races lie older, unexplained cultures and baffling hints of pre-Columbian, even pre-Christian contact between the new and the old world. Again, you think it came right out of the Book of Mormon. Then they quoted him again and said that he is the god of the air, and when he came here to the Americas, it happened a few years after Christ had come in the flesh. The books of Chilam Balam. I'm just going to read a little bit. These are well-known texts written in the Yucatan in the 1500s, mostly. These, like virtually all of the pre-Columbian beliefs and writings, contain biblical truths. Now, look how dumbfounded the Catholic leaders were when they found Christianity, when they came here to the Americas. That's why he said, these, like virtually all of the pre-Columbian beliefs and writings, contain biblical truths. that are inexplicable and dumbfounding to the Spanish historians in the early 1500s when they arrived with the conquerors. They had few answers to the source of origin of these teachings of Genesis, found to be ever present in all Indian legends. A book called Recordación Florida is one that I found in these, that we microfilmed 1985. It was written by Captain Antonio de Fuentes y Guzman, 3 large volumes. Now, he was born in Guatemala in 1643. He was a little bit later. In the book, in the first volume, page 23, it says, "Where did these Indians come from? They, as some insist, are descendants of Ham, and some descendants of Noah, or like others prefer, they originated with Issachar, who was Jacob's 5th grandchild. In their own manuscripts, in which they have kept record of themselves, they mention Abraham. And due to the great diversity of languages and that they speak, they seem to be descendants of those who scattered out from the Babylonian tower. According to references in the manuscripts of these Indians, that when our Redeemer Jesus Christ was born, these lands were already populated, for that marvelous manifestation was evident and universally in all these lands. In my estimation, they possessed the land 2,000 years or so prior to the conquest, and for such reason we propose that they were Babylonians." Now, a friar named Motilinia. This man was born in 1482. He was collecting the history from the ancients, and he said the oldest wise men of the Tlaxcaltecas state that their ancestors came from the northeast. They are indications they came from the dispersion of the grandsons of Noah. Others, for certain reasons and conditions, believe the natives came from the Jews. Talked about the white-bearded gun again, Quetzalcoatl, who was an honest man, who was temperate. He started penance, fasts, and discipline. He was not married. He did not know a woman. He lived honestly and was chaste. Quetzalcoatl was regarded by the Indians as one of their principal gods. He was called the god of the air. They stated in their antiquities, also their lineage, wars, defeats, and many other things worthy of quality worth remembering, that these Mexicans came to New Spain and recorded their history 448 years prior to 1540. This man, Mendieta, is another Catholic friar. He was born 1528. He said the god or idol of Cholula was called Quetzalcoatl and considered to be the best and most worthy above all other gods. He was white, well-built, broad forehead, large eyes, long black hair, full round beard. He was canonized as the supreme god for whom they felt great love and reverence and devotion. They offered him sacrifices for 3 reasons. He was totally honest, chaste, moderate, revered, the Lord of excellence, and when they said Lord, one understood this to be Quetzalcoatl and none other. He was considered by the Indians to be the principal god. They called him the god of the air. When these lands were discovered, their religion and customs were foreign and contrary to our Catholic Christianity. But on the other hand, I'm greatly perplexed due to the vestiges confirmed by highly trustworthy people, wherein the natives knew much about our faith before we arrived. Page 538. From a woman a great prophet was to be born. This really stunned the Catholic fathers. From a woman a great prophet was to be born, who was to come from heaven. She would give birth without having joined with a man, and she remained a virgin. This great prophet would be pursued with malintent. They would crucify him on a cross. He was crucified and had his hands and feet tied to the cross without nails. It was a sign that he would be resurrected and raised in heaven. The Dominican fathers said they found these teachings written on leather among the Indians that lived in the southern coast of the sea. In this way their ancestors left their memories. All of these testimonies and sayings referred to leaves us to suspect that the ancestors of the indigenous people before 1500 had knowledge of the mysteries of our Christian faith long before we arrived. Diego Duran was a Dominican friar. He wrote this. He was born in 1537, and he was a Jew, was converted to Catholicism, was a very faithful friar. But he had all this knowledge and background of Judaism, along with a good knowledge of Christianity. And so you won't be surprised at some of the things he states here. He said, I wish to speak of a great man who arrived in these great lands, a man of religious nature. This Topiltzin, who was thusly called by the Indians, also called Father, was venerable and very religious. He said, the feats and marvels of Topiltzin, as well as his heroic acts, are celebrated and honored among the Indians. They had the appearance of miracles, but my Catholic Church forbids me to call them such. The Holy Gospel of St. Mark says that God told his holy apostles to go to the entire world and preach his gospel to every creature, promising to those who believed and were baptized would have eternal life. I do not dare affirm that this great man may well have been a blessed apostle. From whence do we suspect that the original Indians came from? And without reading all of these, they were Jews. They were Hebrews. And in page 14 of the second volume, he says, I confirm my opinion and suspect that these indigenous people were of the 12 tribes of Israel. The reader will see in Genesis 1 and 2 that we have talked about, this is the Catholic friar, that the Indians knew about the creation of the world in Genesis 2. They knew about the giants. They knew about the Tower of Babylonia. They knew all these things and others through their ancestors and their families before them. Torquemada is one of the better known historians. Torquemada was born 1557, later than most of them. He talked about, again, this great god Quetzalcoatl, who was among these indigenous people. He was their god. They say he was a white man, large of body, a beautiful wide forehead, large eyes, long black hair, and a great round beard. Many regarded him simply as God himself. Francisco Lopez de Gomara, another historian. He was born in 1511. The Indians believed this Quetzalcoatl to be God himself. Quetzalcoatl was a male virgin, penitent, honest, temperate, self-restrained, religious, and holy. He preached the natural law. The Indians believed him to be God. He disappeared at the edge of the sea. Martir de Angleria, born 1459. The Spaniards saw in the Yucatan that they had crosses, and upon questioning them as to their origin, several answered by saying, when a certain unusually handsome man, a great hero, passed by this area, he left the cross as a remembrance. Others said, on it, the cross, there died the man more resplendent or radiant than the sun. Boturini is known in many circles. He was born in 1702, much later than the others. But the reason he wrote, because he said, I found documents and manuscripts of an ancient nature never available to any of the previous historians. So he said, I was forced, because of that, to write this book. Regarding the extremely old history of these indigenous people who preserved their memories, they did it with colored maps painted with figures, symbols, characters, and hieroglyphs. I saw them in the hands of the chiefs, or caciques, de Sulinaki. He said one of the original maps they preserved was with the very ancient memory of the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel. They did not understand each other's language. They parted with their wives. At last they arrived in the land of New Spain, or the Americas. And the Tower of Babel was recorded in old songs by the Indians so they would remember their history. couple more. There's the well-known, probably the most well-known Mexican named Pina Chan, who died not too many years ago, who also was puzzled by this Quetzalcoatl. He was the deity of Venus. He was the creator and giver of life. He was not born of a real personage, but of a god. First he was a god, then a myth, then he was a man. And two more. When I was mission president a long time ago, we had the bottom four countries of Central America, and then they asked us to open Venezuela to the work. This was in November 1966. When Dorothy and I were at a city called Maracaibo, we thought it was the oven of the earth. It was even harder than Nicaragua. But a young man came up to us. He said, "I see you have great interest in my past," or that is to say the past of the original people of Venezuela. "Would you accept this book as a gift?" Because it was written by a well-known archaeologist who went to the very southern part of Venezuela, to the Orinoco River area, and this is what they said. They marveled at the similitude that they found between the ancient Indian religion and the Christianity that they tried to diffuse. This is the primitive chroniclers of the Catholic leaders. Many affirmed that the apostles had been here. Not just a few believed that that same Jesus Christ had taught the American Indians the Mosaic traditions of Genesis. They called him here Amalivaka. He came in a great canoe. His face was the color of the billowy white clouds of the morning. White was his hair falling on his chest. He smiled and said, "I am Amalivaka. I come in the name of Ina Uwiki, my father. I come to bring you food." Then at the end of one chapter, on page 22, it says, "Perhaps Amalivaka was not a god, but a man of divine wisdom. But his comportment among the inhabitants of these lands was so exemplary that he who might attempt to imitate it would scale to the peaks of eternity." This is the legend of the Tamanaco Indians of Venezuela. The well-known magazine U.S. News and World Report wrote a lengthy article, and I don't have time to read that one. But in closing, two things. In 1592, an indigenous man in Guatemala, who was also the historian, wrote the following. His name was Pedro Velasco Sulquet. He was a pureblood. 1592. I read from pages 173 and 176. "We are the sons of Adam. We are the grandsons of Jacob, Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We strayed from holy writings where in the first books were the words of the prophets Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So our first ancestors arrived from Babylon. We the tribes are descendants of the Egyptians and Israelites. The forefathers cried because they lost the righteousness they once had in Egypt. We came from the same place called Babylon, from whence the sun rises, the other side of the lake, the other side of the sea. We in reality are the sons of Jacob." I've tried to give you a taste of these, just a few of these 22 old books that I have, which strongly support, of course, that part of Third Nephi, the coming of the Savior here to the Americas. As I was coming down in the car this morning, I thought, the times you live in are a little perilous. And we have sons, and we have grandsons on missions. And I wanted to give you just one brief illustration of how the Lord watches over our sons and our grandsons and granddaughters and daughters in the mission field. One day when I was presiding over the Central American area, we had about the usual 11 missions, about 3,000 missionaries. Two missionaries came into hurriedly came to the office of one of the mission presidents and said, "President, Elder so-and-so has disappeared. We don't know where he is." He said, "Did you look in all the areas where he used to labor?" They said, "President, we did. We went all over. We knew where he worked. He is nowhere to be found." The president disappeared for just a moment. and came out and got in his car. He said, I saw before my eyes a city. I'd never been there. It was down on the coast. We don't have any missionaries there. We don't have a branch of the church there. But I saw the city. Then I saw a street. And then of all things, I saw a particular door. I knew where that was. And so on that terrible road, which we never take, I decided to drive down. And when he drove down to the coast, all at once he saw the street that he'd seen in vision. Then he saw the door. He knocked on the door. And who opened it? This missionary. He was very surprised, and he said, President, you know, I was lost. I was confused. I decided to come down here to the coast and take a ship and go home. I didn't know why I was there. But as I thought about it and I prayed about it, I knew that I should be in this mission. I knew the work was true. I was just going to come back to you. How in the world did you know I was here? Obviously, when he explained that in detail, the young man was subdued, realized that he was being watched over and cared for. The same applies to our sons, daughters, grandsons and daughters in the field today. Whatever happens is the Lord's will. They are watched over and they are being protected. I pray that each one of us may understand that there are many external evidences supporting the Book of Mormon. These ancient texts. This is one. This is of the friar who wrote in the mid-1500s the history of the Indians of New Spain. Even though they talk in a very detailed manner about many things in the Book of Mormon, it is only through prayer and study that we know, and each one of you knows that the book is true. It is the most tangible evidence supporting the truthfulness of this, the restored Church of Jesus Christ. And I leave my witness with you that there is a God in heaven, and that Joseph the prophet saw the Father, and he saw the Son, and on more than one occasion he heard their voice. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
I think there's something here. Blake, what am I looking for? What am I looking for? Oh. Elder Brewerton, we'd like to present this little gift to you. And, thank you so much for your information. Let's give Elder Brewerton a hand, please.
Thank you. I don't deserve such a beautiful gift as this, but I'm going to keep it.
Thanks so much.